The entire neighborhood lost its mind because their garage doors stopped working. That's the part everyone talks about. That's the story that gets repeated at barbecues, community meetings, and probably every HOA conference within 100 miles. But what nobody talks about is how it all started with one old truck sitting in one old driveway, and a group of people who couldn't stand looking at it. Looking back now, I probably should have seen the trouble coming. My name is Ethan Mercer, and I've lived in the same house for nearly 16 years. The house belonged to my father before me, and his father rented the land before that. It's not fancy. Never was. The paint fades faster than I can afford to replace it, the porch creaks when you walk across it, and the driveway looks like a map of cracked riverbeds after a drought. But it's home. Every dent and scratch on that property means something to me. My father taught me how to rebuild an engine in that driveway. My mother planted flowers along the fence line every spring. When both of them passed, keeping the place felt like keeping a piece of them alive. Then about 8 years ago, Maple Ridge Estates showed up next door. One week it was empty fields. The next it looked like someone dropped an entire catalog of identical houses onto the landscape. Perfect lawns, perfect sidewalks, perfect little decorative trees that all seemed terrified to grow in the wrong direction. The people moving in weren't bad at first. Most kept to themselves. Some even waved when they walked by. But then the HOA started gaining influence, and suddenly everybody became an expert on how everyone else should live. My old Ford F-250 quickly became their favorite target. Now listen, I know it wasn't pretty. The truck had dents on both doors. The paint was chipped. The rear bumper had been welded twice. One side mirror rattled every time I drove over 40 miles an hour. But that truck earned its keep. It hauled lumber, equipment, tools, and more overtime paychecks than I could count. It wasn't a status symbol. It was a working man's truck. Unfortunately, the residents of Maple Ridge seemed personally offended by the fact that they could see it from their walking trail. The complaints started small. A few strange looks. Some whispered conversations that conveniently got louder when I walked by. One afternoon I was changing brake pads when a woman I'd never met stopped near my driveway and said, "You know, a vehicle like that really affects neighborhood appearance." I looked around, thinking she was talking to somebody else. Then I realized she was serious. I smiled and said, "Good thing it's a truck and not a painting." She didn't appreciate that answer. A few weeks later, I received my first letter from the HOA. It claimed my vehicle negatively impacted community aesthetics. I laughed and tossed it in the trash. The second letter suggested I build a privacy fence at my own expense. That one went into the fireplace. The third letter informed me that continued noncompliance could result in enforcement actions. I actually pinned that one to my garage wall because it made my friends laugh whenever they came over. The thing that irritated me most wasn't the letters. It was the assumption behind them. These people genuinely believed they had the right to tell me what to do on property my family had owned long before their subdivision existed. Then came the Thursday that changed everything. I had just finished a brutal double shift at the manufacturing plant. 14 straight hours. My feet hurt. My shoulders hurt. Even my teeth felt tired. All I wanted was to get home, heat up leftover meatloaf, and collapse into bed. I turned into my driveway and immediately knew something was wrong. At first my brain couldn't process it. The space beside the garage looked bigger somehow. Empty. Then reality hit me. My truck was gone. I stopped in the middle of the driveway and stared. The oil stains were still there. The tire marks were still there. But the truck wasn't. My first thought was theft. My second thought was that maybe one of my buddies had pulled a prank. Then I saw the bright orange notice attached to my mailbox. I walked over, ripped it off, and started reading. By the second sentence, my blood pressure was climbing into dangerous territory. According to the notice, my vehicle had been removed due to violations of updated residential appearance standards. Removed. Such a polite word for stealing someone's truck. At the bottom was the name of a towing company and a retrieval fee of $428. I remember standing there in complete silence. Not because I was calm. Because I was so angry my brain temporarily stopped working. After a minute I got back in my truck, drove straight to the Maple Ridge Clubhouse, and walked into the middle of their monthly board meeting. The room went silent the second I entered. Everyone knew why I was there. Sitting at the head of the table was HOA President Diane Holloway, a woman who somehow managed to look smug even while holding a wine glass. I held up the notice and asked one simple question. Who authorized towing my truck? Diane folded her hands and smiled like a teacher explaining basic math to a child. Mr. Mercer, multiple notices were sent regarding your violation. Violation of what? I asked. Community standards. I laughed so hard a few people actually flinched. I'm not part of your community. That's when Diane slid a thick folder across the table. Actually, she said, according to revised boundary agreements approved several years ago, portions of your property now fall under Maple Ridge governance. I opened the folder and stared at pages of legal documents I had never seen before. Boundary revisions, annexation agreements, county filings. Somehow, through a maze of paperwork and technicalities, they had managed to extend HOA authority over part of my land. Diane leaned back in her chair, completely confident she had won. Pay the towing fee, bring the vehicle into compliance, and this matter can be resolved. The room watched me carefully, expecting an argument. What they got instead was silence. Because while Diane was talking, a memory had surfaced in the back of my mind. A very important memory. 20 years earlier, long before Maple Ridge existed, a telecommunications company had signed a lease agreement with my father. And suddenly I realized something the entire HOA had forgotten. Something sitting on my property that their fancy little neighborhood depended on every single day. The moment that realization clicked into place, I stopped being angry. And when a man stops being angry and starts smiling instead, that's usually when the real trouble begins. The drive home from the clubhouse was the calmest I'd felt all evening, which probably sounds strange considering my truck was still sitting in an impound lot, and I was $428 poorer than I had been that morning. But anger had been replaced by clarity, and clarity is a dangerous thing when somebody has backed you into a corner. You see, 20 years earlier, before Maple Ridge Estates existed, before the HOA had its first rulebook, and before anyone started measuring grass height with a ruler, a telecommunications company called Horizon Wireless approached my father about leasing part of our back acreage. They wanted a small communications relay tower on the far edge of the property where nobody would notice it. My father wasn't a complicated man. They offered steady monthly income, promised minimal disruption, and handed him a contract. He signed it. After he passed away, the lease transferred to me. Most of the time, I barely thought about it. A maintenance truck showed up every now and then, a direct deposit landed in my account each month, and life went on. What most people didn't realize was that the tower wasn't just some random piece of equipment sitting in a field. Over the years, as Maple Ridge expanded, developers relied heavily on that infrastructure. Their smart gate systems, wireless security networks, garage automation systems, remote monitoring services, and countless connected devices all piggybacked on communication equipment routed through that relay network. It wasn't the only system keeping them connected, but it was a very important one. More importantly, the access equipment sat entirely on my property under lease terms that required my cooperation for maintenance access. The next morning I called Horizon Wireless and spent nearly an hour reviewing documents. By lunchtime I understood something very interesting. The lease agreement gave me significant rights regarding property access, infrastructure upgrades, utility easements, and maintenance scheduling. Nothing illegal, nothing destructive, but enough leverage to make life very uncomfortable for people who had just declared war on me. So I started making phone calls. The first call went to the towing company. They confirmed Maple Ridge HOA had requested removal of the truck. The second call went to a lawyer named Frank Donnelly, a friend of mine who enjoyed HOA disputes almost as much as he enjoyed fishing. After hearing the story, Frank laughed for nearly 30 seconds. "Ethan," he finally said, "these people may have just created the most expensive mistake of their lives." "How expensive?" I asked. "Let's find out." Over the next few days, Frank uncovered something fascinating. The annexation documents Diane proudly showed me were legally questionable. Not necessarily invalid, but questionable. Several notification requirements appeared incomplete. Certain disclosures seemed absent. More importantly, exemptions existed for legacy properties predating subdivision incorporation. The deeper we looked, the messier things became. Meanwhile, I paid the towing fee, retrieved my truck, and parked it exactly where it had always been. 2 days later, another violation notice appeared. Then another. Then a warning threatening daily fines. It became obvious the HOA wasn't interested in compromise. They wanted submission. They wanted me to become an example. So I decided they could become one instead. Frank drafted several formal notices regarding access rights, utility coordination requirements, and infrastructure reviews connected to the tower lease. Horizon Wireless, eager to avoid liability, temporarily suspended several planned upgrades and remote support functions pending clarification of property access disputes. Nobody thought much of it at first. Then little problems started appearing throughout Maple Ridge. The front entrance gate began experiencing communication delays. Residents found themselves waiting several extra minutes to enter. Smart garage systems occasionally lost synchronization. Security camera networks experienced intermittent outages. The HOA hired technicians. The technicians blamed software updates. The software vendors blamed hardware. The hardware companies blamed service providers. Everyone blamed someone else. A week later, the problems multiplied. Community message boards exploded with complaints. One resident couldn't remotely access her garage. Another couldn't connect to security cameras while traveling. Several smart doorbell systems stopped sending notifications. Every day brought a new headache. Every day brought another emergency meeting. And every day I sat on my porch after work drinking iced tea while watching HOA board members drive around looking increasingly stressed. Diane still hadn't connected the dots. Neither had most residents. They assumed technology was malfunctioning because technology always malfunctions eventually. But then something happened that changed the tone entirely. One Saturday morning, a large Horizon Wireless service crew arrived to inspect equipment. Because of ongoing property disputes involving access rights, inspections took far longer than expected. Temporary interruptions occurred throughout portions of the network while systems were evaluated and rerouted. Within hours, Maple Ridge descended into chaos. Garage doors stopped responding consistently. Gate access systems malfunctioned. Several monitoring services went offline. Homeowners flooded the HOA office with calls. By Monday morning, residents were furious. By Tuesday, they were demanding answers. By Wednesday, Diane was standing on my front porch. She wasn't alone. For board members stood behind her looking exhausted. Gone were the wine glasses and confident smiles. Gone was the superiority. Diane knocked. I opened the door. "Can I help you?" I asked. Her jaw tightened. "We need to discuss the communications infrastructure issue." "What communications infrastructure issue?" I asked innocently. The look she gave me could have stripped paint from a battleship. "Mr. Mercer, this situation is negatively affecting hundreds of residents." "You mean like towing someone's vehicle from his own driveway?" One board member sighed loudly. Another looked away. Diane tried a different approach. "We're prepared to discuss solutions." "Interesting," I said. "Last week you were prepared to discuss community standards." For several seconds nobody spoke. Finally Diane asked, "What exactly do you want?" It was the first sensible question she'd asked since this started. I handed her a folder. Inside was a proposal prepared by Frank. Reimbursement of towing fees. Removal of all vehicle-related restrictions affecting my property. Permanent written exemption from future HOA enforcement actions. Compensation for legal expenses. Formal acknowledgement of property rights. Revised infrastructure cooperation agreements. And one additional clause that significantly increased annual lease compensation associated with future access negotiations. Diane flipped through the pages. Her face went pale. "This is ridiculous." "Maybe," I said. "So is towing my truck." She closed the folder. "We're not agreeing to this." "Then I guess you'll need more emergency meetings." The board left angry. Very angry. For the next 10 days, Maple Ridge became a case study in how quickly convenience turns into dependency. Residents who once bragged about fully automated homes suddenly discovered how much effort ordinary life required. Community forums turned vicious. Homeowners blamed the board. The board blamed contractors. Contractors blamed vendors. Vendors blamed service providers. Every meeting grew louder. Every complaint became more personal. Frank occasionally called just to share updates from public records and community discussions. Apparently, some residents were considering recalls of board members. Others demanded independent audits. One particularly angry homeowner accused the HOA leadership of incompetence during a meeting that reportedly lasted 4 hours. Through it all, I continued living my life. I went to work. I mowed my lawn. I drove my truck. Every evening I parked it in the exact same spot. And every evening somebody from Maple Ridge drove past and glared at it. Then, about 2 weeks after Diane's first visit, another knock came at my door. This time there were no threats. No speeches. No smug smiles. Just tired people carrying paperwork. The war was finally costing them more than it was costing me. And for the first time since this entire mess started, the HOA board had come prepared to surrender. When I opened the door that evening, Diane looked 10 years older than she had the first time she stood on my porch. The confidence was gone. The board members behind her looked like people who hadn't slept properly in days. Nobody was carrying wine glasses anymore. Nobody was talking about community standards. They were carrying folders, calculators, and the expression people get when reality finally sends them the bill. Diane held up a stack of papers and said, "We're prepared to settle." I stepped aside and invited them in. We sat around my kitchen table, the same table my father used to drink coffee at every morning before work. For a moment, I couldn't help noticing the contrast. These were people who had spent years acting like they ran the community, and now they were sitting in a worn-out kitchen asking a factory worker for mercy. Diane slid the agreement across the table. The HOA would reimburse every dollar of the towing fee. They would eliminate all vehicle-related restrictions connected to my property. They would grant a permanent exemption from future aesthetic enforcement. They would cover legal expenses. They would formally acknowledge my property's independent status. Most importantly, they agreed to revised infrastructure cooperation terms and a significantly higher compensation structure connected to future access negotiations. Frank had reviewed everything beforehand. Legally speaking, it was airtight. Diane signed first. Then the rest of the board followed. I signed last. The entire process took less than 10 minutes. Funny thing about power. People think it's about who has the biggest budget, the fanciest title, or the most rules. Most of the time, it's about leverage. And leverage has a habit of showing up where nobody expects it. Over the following weeks, the technical disputes were resolved, service issues disappeared, and Maple Ridge slowly returned to normal. Garage doors worked. Security systems came back online. Residents stopped panicking. The board quietly stopped talking about community standards whenever my name came up. As for my truck, it remained exactly where it had always been. Same cracked driveway, same faded paint, same dented bumper. The difference was that now nobody had the authority to touch it. A month later, I ran into one of the homeowners at a gas station. He recognized me immediately and shook his head. "You're the truck guy, aren't you?" I laughed. "Depends who's asking." He smiled. "Half the neighborhood says you're a hero. The other half says you're a menace. Which half are you in?" I asked. He thought about it for a second. "Honestly, I think everybody involved got exactly what they deserved." Then he climbed into his SUV and drove away. I've thought about that conversation a lot since then, because the truth is, this story isn't really about a truck. It isn't about an HOA either. It's about what happens when people become so obsessed with control that they forget respect comes first. If Diane had simply walked over and introduced herself years earlier, maybe none of this would have happened. If someone had treated me like a neighbor instead of a problem to be managed, we probably would have found common ground. But that's not what happened. They chose authority over conversation. They chose enforcement over common sense. And eventually they discovered that not every person is willing to quietly accept being pushed around. To this day, whenever I back my old Ford into that driveway after a long shift, I still smile a little. Not because I won, not because they lost, but because every scratch on that truck reminds me of something important. People can write rules. They can create committees. They can hold meetings and vote on policies. But none of that gives them ownership over somebody else's dignity. And that's a lesson Maple Ridge Estates ended up learning the hard way. Now I'm curious what you think. Did the HOA cross the line the moment they towed the truck? Or did I take things too far when I pushed back? If you were in my position, would you have accepted the settlement or kept fighting? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this always divide people right down the middle, and honestly, that's what makes them worth talking about.